Carl Mosk graduated from Berkeley in 1966 with a degree in mathematics and then completed a master's in mathematics at MIT before shifting his PhD topic at Harvard to economics. After graduating in 1976, he spent 8 years teaching economics back at Berkeley and 4 more years at nearby Santa Clara University. Then in 1988, he managed to secure a spot at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, one of the nicest spots on earth to live and work, and naturally has remained there for the rest of his life so far. People only ever leave the University of Victoria feet first. This article on the demographic transition in Japan, taken from part of his dissertation research, appeared in the Journal of Economic History the year after he completed his PhD. We consider it here because it provides a detailed look into an example of the demographic transition as it occurred in a non-Western society somewhat later than the mainstream of transitions that had started earlier in Europe. This article provides an interesting follow-up to the earlier work on Japan's demographic transition by Kingsley Davis.
The introductory description of the classical demographic transition that Mosk shares with us should seem as familiar as an old friend. He reviews for us the idea of stages, starting with high birth and death rates, then death rates falling first, followed by fertility decline later, and eventual arrival at an equilibrium of low vital rates. He then points out, as we have also heard from other writers, that this model of transition stages was abstracted mostly from observations of European populations. In particular, countries in northwestern Europe had the most extensive and reliable demographic data, reaching the farthest back into their histories, so it was possible to get a clearer picture of the trends over time in birth rates and death rates, without which we can't begin to look for patterns like a demographic transition. This geographical and historical focus for the original foundations of demographic transition theory means that whenever we begin to consider similar processes of change in other parts of the world, one of the first questions that comes up inevitably will be whether different starting conditions for the process in different times and places might require us to modify our picture of the transition itself. Going in on this question, Mosk follows up his introductory summary of classical transition theory with a closer look at what he calls unique features of the situation in Europe. In particular, he calls attention to an unusual feature of marriage timing that many other scholars have noticed. This pattern, which John Haenel called the European marriage pattern, was not really present universally all over Europe. Haenel's description of this pattern identified a line drawn from Trieste on the Adriatic coast of Italy up through Poland to St. Petersburg on the Baltic coast of Russia. What Haenel called the European marriage pattern was actually confined to the northwest side of this line, where he detected something unusual that dated back long before any hint of the urban industrial revolution had put in any appearance in Europe or any place else in the world. This much older pattern featured unusually late ages at marriage for both men and women, and also a relatively high share of people who remained single throughout their adult reproductive years. In fact, it is very interesting to note that this ancient European pattern of late marriage was particularly strong in the British Isles, where Malthus produced his essay on the principle of population. It turns out that when the Reverend Malthus was advising people that delayed marriage was the best alternative for checking the power of population, he apparently was preaching to a choir that already had been taking this advice for some time. Southeast of the Haenel line, but also at the furthest reaches of the Italian and Iberian peninsulas, people usually married much earlier and more universally. The fact of the ancient and distinctive European marriage pattern had clear implications for how any kind of demographic transition would have to take place there. Since people were already marrying relatively late in life, traditional pre-transition birth rates already reflected that reality. Mosk points out that once people did manage to get married in northwestern European societies, they had to concentrate on pretty intensive reproductive activity to produce a high birth rate, high enough to counteract the high infant and child mortality of those days. This means that when death rates began to decline, the characteristic demographic response in this part of the world also had to concentrate on fertility within these already late marriages. People had to take into account that more of their children were now surviving, so they would now reach whatever desired goal they might have for family size with fewer births. To put this in terms of Davis's multiphasic response, they had to focus on possibly longer delays between marriage and first birth and longer intervals between births. In fact, if rising levels of prosperity and standards of living actually made it possible to marry a little earlier, which Mosk says indeed did happen to some extent during the European demographic transition, they would need to compensate even more with fewer births spaced further apart. So in this respect, when Mosk turns to his own subject of demographic transition in Japan, he points out for us a very strong contrast in the initial conditions prevailing in society when such transition was just getting started. In Japan and in East Asian societies in general, as we already have seen in other research, virtually everybody got married. There was no discernible fraction of the population that remained single and childless throughout their lives, as we find in many European pre-transition societies. And at least for women, this universal marriage also took place very early in life. The fact of arranged marriages in Japan, as we have seen in China, meant that families married off their daughters almost immediately after they reached puberty and packed them off to go and live with their husbands and produce children for their husbands' families. The strong patriarchal traditions in East Asia, after all, meant that in practical economic terms, daughters were a drain on their parents' families that would never be paid back later in adulthood, as the married daughters devoted themselves to their new households. This problem did not affect the lives or the marriage timing of Japanese men to the same extent. When men married in Japan, their new wives represented a gain in manpower and productivity for their families, and in particular a guarantee of both new children for the future and somebody to take care of the husband's parents when they began to grow older and more frail. These arranged marriages may have been a little misleading for demographers in one sense. Because most marriages were arranged by the parents of the bride and the groom, the young ages at which women almost universally got married may reflect the timing of the deals made by the parental families, but may not always have indicated the beginning of the actual period of exposure to the risk of getting pregnant and having babies. For the youngest women, arranged marriages sometimes were agreed on and formalized years before the couple actually began living together or building a family of their own. And once she did begin to live with her husband, a Japanese bride did not usually experience the neo-local residence pattern that people expect, for example, in the United States. She usually just moved into the household of her husband, where she might find other members of his family, including his parents, and possibly even some of his brothers and sisters, and perhaps some of their children. In these extended family households, even privacy for the young married couple was not something you could automatically take for granted. In many ways, then, the early marriage pattern of Japan created a quite different starting point for the demographic transition in that society compared to the European one. While in Europe this transition had to focus on lowering fertility within marriages, in Japan the transition tended to focus instead on shifting the timing of marriage, particularly for women, to later ages instead. As it turns out, Mosk identifies several practical reasons why this shift to later marriage age made sense for the Japanese, and these reasons are not all about the better survival of infants and children. Mosk's article shows not just one, but 3 series of fertility measures for periods both before and after the Second World War. These are the points in time for which he feels he has data that are reliable enough to report statistically in this way. The first row of the table shows the crude birth rate, which is simply the number of births divided by the total population of the country in each year, expressed as births per thousand population. The denominator of this rate includes both men and women and also includes people of all ages, including children and old people, so the crude birth rate can be influenced by all sorts of things like a changing sex ratio of men to women, which is usually not an issue in most populations, or by a change in the age distribution, which is very much a problem in most populations. The second row shows the general fertility rate, which divides the number of births by the number of women only, further restricted only to the childbearing ages, usually taken as from about 15 to 49 years old. This gets rid of the people in the denominator of the crude birth rate who couldn't have been having babies anyway, the men and the children and the old people. Since about half the population should be men, the GFR should be twice as high as the CBR when they are left out of the denominator. Since about half of all women are usually younger or older than the childbearing ages, leaving them out of the denominator as well should just about double the GFR again. A comparison of the first and second rows of the table will show that the second row of rates is usually somewhere around 4 times higher than the first row, just as it should be when all of these other people are excluded from the denominator. The final row in the table further excludes from the denominator any of the women in the childbearing ages who are not actually married. It is called the marital general fertility rate. If this rate were the same as the GFR, that would mean that all the women in the childbearing ages were married. To the extent that this third row is higher than the GFR, this happens because excluding the unmarried women is making the denominator smaller and inflating the resulting rate. Comparing this last row to the others then gives us a way to look specifically at possible delays in marriage timing and resulting higher shares of unmarried women during the young childbearing ages, where a lot of births would normally be happening. Within the decades shown in the table, Mosk draws a distinction between the fertility decline that took place before the war and the decline in the post-war period. The pre-war period between 1920 and 1935 witnessed a slight drop in the Japanese birth rate. For example, the crude birth rate, or CBR, declined from 37.8 to 31.9 births per thousand people in Japan, which amounts to a drop of about 1/6, or 16% of the initial level. While this is a modest change, it is clear evidence of fertility decline in the pre-war period. Even more importantly for Mosk, this change does not translate into an equivalent drop in the marital general fertility rate in the third row of figures in the table. Among married women in the reproductive ages, fertility only declined by about 6 percentage points in the pre-war period. The 1920 rate of 218 births per thousand married women meant about 1/5 of all women had a baby during a year at the beginning of this period. By 1935, the equivalent figure was still clearly over 200 births per thousand married women, indicating that within Japanese marriages, the rate of having babies had hardly changed at all. How can the crude birth rate show such a different trend than the marital general fertility rate? The answer, of course, depends on who we find in the denominators of the two rates. For instance, if married women keep on having babies at about the same rate over time, but if more and more women in the general population remain unmarried for more years in early adulthood, then all those unmarried women will show up in the denominator of the crude birth rate anyway. In Japan in the early 20th century, unmarried women almost never had babies, so more unmarried women in the population would lead to a lower crude birth rate. This difference in the trend for the different measures allows us to conclude that delayed marriage must have played a key role in the pre-war declines of Japan's birth rate. By comparison, Mosk's figures also show us a much more dramatic fall in fertility after the war. In just the 10 years from 1950 to 1960, as Kingsley Davis already had pointed out some years earlier, Japan's crude birth rate was nearly cut in half, from 30 births per thousand population to only 17. And this time, the same steep fall in fertility is observed in all 3 rows of the table. The marital general fertility rate in the bottom row fell by 43%, at the same time that the crude birth rate fell by 40% of the 1950 levels. This tells us 2 things at once about the post-war period. First, it tells us that marriages were not being delayed significantly more by 1960 compared to 1950, because the fall in the marital GFR was actually greater than for the population in general. There may actually have been a slight drop in the share of women who remained unmarried in this period. And second, it tells us that the decline was the result of changes in reproductive behavior within marriage, the control of marital fertility, which had been vanishingly unimportant before the war. This then is the pattern of fertility decline that Mosk has to explain. To do this, he organizes his analysis not only in terms of the pre-war and post-war periods in Japanese history, but also by distinguishing between prefectures that the Japanese listed under the heading of shi for cities, and other prefectures that they labeled as gun or rural counties. In the rural areas of Japan, he concentrates on two complementary factors that he believes explain fertility decline, particularly the pre-war declines that happened as a result of delayed marriages. The first of these is the well-known effect of falling infant death rates on decisions about additional children. Ever since Kingsley Davis, we usually think about this as what Mosk calls the dependency effect. That is, if people are no longer having to replace infants who died with new births, they'll have fewer births as a result. If women don't have to have so many births, this takes the pressure off families to get their daughters married early. Mosk calls his other explanatory factor the employment effect. Now, everybody who lived in a rural agricultural area of Japan was always employed, including all the children who had their share of chores around the farm. But Mosk is talking about a special kind of employment. He means paying jobs. If young women found paid employment, as dutiful daughters, they of course turned over their earnings to their parents. Wealth flowed upward from children to parents, just as Caldwell said it used to do. This gave parents a powerful incentive to keep their daughters single, because as long as they were single, they belonged to their parents, and so did any money they earned. After marriage, they would belong to the husband and his family. So Mosk expects to see more young single women in the rural areas of Japan where there were more chances for this kind of paying jobs. His tables 2 and 3 give us information about both of these potential explanations, and here you can see the shares of women still single at ages 20 to 24 from table 3, arranged according to the level of the crude death rate in each area on one axis and the level of female employment on the other. Both of his factors emerge clearly as making a difference in shares of women remaining single. The lower the death rate, the more women are staying single. The higher the chance for paying jobs, the more women also are staying single. These two explanations each reinforce the other to show that both of them apparently had something to do with the pre-war trend in Japan toward later marriages. As the country modernized, both mortality decline and positions in the paid labor force became more noticeable, and both of them helped to get Japan started in its demographic transition. Mosk's evidence for what he called an employment effect on the timing of marriage for young women. When young Japanese women in rural areas found paying jobs outside agriculture, they tended to marry later. Mosk thought that because parents benefited from their daughters' incomes, they played a part in delaying such marriages. Of course, this argument would apply mainly to older parents whose children were already grown up enough to enter the labor force. But timing of marriages was only one of the possible multiphasic responses that could contribute to fertility decline and demographic transition. During the pre-war period, Mosk found that these marriage delays played an important part in the early fertility declines. But we have also seen that in the post-war period, marriage delays no longer were important, and the other response of fertility changes within marriage emerged instead as the most important factor. In fact, Mosk even identifies marital fertility effects during the pre-war period, but only in some special circumstances. What might cause young married women to have fewer children after they did get married? When he tackles this problem, Mosk settles on an explanation that is almost the complete opposite of the employment effect that made older parents keep their daughters single longer. He calls this explanation child employability. And this time, instead of paying jobs outside of agriculture, he is talking specifically about farm work itself, and even more specifically about such work being done by children, people under age 15. He argues that people would have more children in situations where they needed more hands to work on the land. So having fewer children would happen only in situations when people had less need for agricultural workers. But how could he identify situations where people needed more or fewer workers in agriculture? Mosk's solution is to sort out the rural regions of Japan into categories based on population density. Where population density was low, he assumes that each family had more land to deal with and would need more workers. Where population density was high, he assumes that families had smaller holdings of land and would not need additional children to help with the work. So people in high-density areas should have fewer children than people in low-density areas. look at the figures he presents in his Table 4, we do indeed find some evidence of this pattern he expects. But it only occurs in the top row of the table for areas where less than 20% of all women had outside paying jobs, the lowest level of such employment. If we plot the marital fertility rates of such low employment areas according to their population densities, we see a rate of over 260 births per 1,000 married women in the areas with the lowest population density, areas with less than 3 people per cho. A cho is about 100 square meters, roughly the size of 2 football fields side by side. By comparison, the birth rate was less than 200 births per 1,000 married women in areas that had 6 or more persons per cho of land. But this density effect only shows up in places where there are few alternatives to agricultural labor. Where people could get other kinds of paying jobs, density of land had nothing to do with marital fertility rates. Although he did find these contrasts in birth rates among married women in different parts of pre-war Japan, such differences did not play much of a role in the overall national fertility decline observed before the war. After all, population density patterns themselves were not changing all that much during these decades, so even if fertility differences existed, there was no reason that the overall national birth rate should decline. But after the surrender of Japan and the end of the war, it was a different story. At the very beginning of his article, Mosk already points out that the pre-war decline depended on delays in marriage timing, but the even bigger post-war drop in birth rates was due instead pretty much entirely to married women having fewer births, starting later and spacing them farther apart. So we should examine what explanations he finds for that post-war change in the reproductive behavior of Japanese married couples. In dealing with the rapid fertility decline after the war, Mosk has to deal with one existing explanation that was still widely accepted at the time. After World War II, the victorious Allies imposed a new constitution on Japan and also dictated a number of new laws and policies for the Japanese government. One of these new laws made free access to induced abortion legal and at the discretion of women to request. In part, this reflected the feeling among some Allied advisors that Japan's pre-war imperialist expansion in East Asia and the Pacific had been fueled by rapid population growth, which in turn depended on a high birth rate. It is true that immediately after this new law went into effect, the abortion rate skyrocketed in Japan, and the birth rate dropped more rapidly in the following decade than ever seen before in the world. Mosk acknowledges the effect of the 1948 law. He used the language of the economists to describe this effect, calling it a reduction in the costs of fertility control. In particular, he was talking about the social and psychological costs of responses like abortion, which before the war had been much higher in social and legal terms. But Mosk does not give this new legal framework a primary role in explaining the longer-term post-war fertility decline in Japan. After all, the abortion rate also began to decline shortly afterwards. Here he follows the lead traced by Kingsley Davis more than a decade earlier, since he too recognizes that both induced abortions and live births gradually declined to lower and lower levels for more than half a century after the end of World War II. Kingsley Davis used to say that access to birth control methods like abortion and contraceptives was like an airline ticket. People could use such methods to get where they wanted to go, but first they had to want to go somewhere. That is, they had to want to change their reproductive behavior. As Mosk puts it, such reproductive legislation can perhaps accelerate and reinforce a fertility decline, but after all, making abortions legal and introducing contraceptive technologies will only find a response in the population if people have an underlying wish to restrict their fertility. So Mosk has to identify the deeper social currents that might have created this demand for all the trappings of fertility control. In addition to falling infant and child mortality, which was going on throughout the entire 20th century in Japan, he had to find factors that in particular would have contributed to the faster fall of the birth rate after World War II. While he mentions several possibilities that already had been discussed by other writers, he settles on two that he finds particularly convincing in terms of the empirical evidence that he has explored. First, he argues that expanding employment opportunities for women in urban areas gave stronger and stronger incentives for avoiding births as the decades passed. While this had drawn young women from rural areas even in the pre-war period, and given their parents as well as themselves good motives for delayed marriage, in the post-war period he notes that even more rapid expansion of cities magnified this effect and encouraged fertility reductions within marriage as well as later marriage ages. The second factor he emphasizes is similar to conclusions that other writers have reached about fertility decline in the United States and other countries. So long as people had a possibility for their children to enrich them by working, either at home in agriculture or in urban factories, fertility remained high. Caldwell called it wealth flowing from children to parents. But over the course of the 20th century, the Japanese government put more and more restrictions on this ability of parents to turn a profit from their children. Just as in the United States, the most important government actions in this regard combined laws against child labor and especially mandatory school attendance laws. Mosk reviews the gradual extension of mandatory school attendance in Japan to older and older ages as the century continued, eliminating the possibility that children might be earning money for their parents, and in fact actually turning those children into expensive liabilities instead. Caldwell called it wealth flowing from parents to children. In Japan, as elsewhere, Mosk finds that this crucial switch, engineered largely by government policies, seems to have triggered the final stage of the country's demographic transition to low birth rates as well as death rates.